Welcome to Impact the World, the show for and about creatives, changemakers, and entrepreneurs. This is a conversation episode where a special guest shares with me what they are creating and the behind-the-scenes journey of their experience. Hi, welcome to Impact the World, and my guest for this show is Carolyn Costin. Carolyn has been a pioneer in the world of eating disorder recovery for 40 years. And when I first met Carolyn, I was not only struck by the work she had done in the world and really how she had had to go against convention in order to pioneer, but also her spirit and her connection to spirituality. I also had my own experience with an eating disorder in my teens, so it was interesting to talk to her a little about that too and what the origins of eating disorders are. But for those of you who feel completely disconnected to eating disorders, you might enjoy this conversation anyway as we speak about our society's culture where weight and body image are concerned and how it is its own kind of disease. So I hope you enjoy this show, and as ever, if you want to support the show, you can subscribe, rate, or review the show over on Apple Podcasts. Enjoy. Carolyn, thank you so much for being here. You and I got connected, I think it was almost a year ago, by Deva and Miten, who are your good friends. And it was so funny when we met immediately. I think within about 10 minutes, I was like, oh, I'd love to have Carolyn on the show to talk about the work that you've done in the world, because you've been a real pioneer.
That's so great to hear. Makes me feel good.
Good. So, I mean, maybe for people who aren't familiar with your work, could you kind of take us right back to the beginning of really what was the seed for you around this dedication that you have had to the field of eating disorders and recovery?
Well, it's so interesting because I think most people think, oh, because I had an eating disorder myself, obviously that's how I got into this. And it is in a way, but there were a lot of other little pieces along the way, I mean, I never thought for a minute that this thing I had that almost killed me, I was going to make my life's work. But, I think in some ways we are set up like that, the wounded healer kind of thing. But, I suffered from my own eating disorder. Oh gosh, it's over 40, it's over 50. Oh my God, I'm getting older. 50 years ago, when I got this diagnosis, and never would I have realized that it would lead to not only a tumultuous experience journey where I discovered so much and opened myself up to so much, but also eventually then became an eating disorder therapist in 1979, long before this was ever really exposed to the world so much, I mean, it was before Karen Carpenter was on the cover of Time magazine, and that sort of exploded things in, I think, the early 80s. And I just started with a private practice, but soon realized that a lot of people need more help. And they need more help than just what an individual therapist can provide. And that led to my running hospital programs, which then I thought this is an abysmal way to treat people. And I really wanted to open a place that I thought would be the kind of place I would have wanted to go when I had my own eating disorder. And there were no residential treatment centers at the time. Now they're sort of, you're ubiquitous in a way, but at the time we were treating people in hospital settings, the white robe, the clinical environment, the kind of place where you'd get your food on a tray with a little silver thing, and people in their lab coats, taking notes while you were eating. I just thought this is not the way for people to get better. And I guess what I want to mention is throughout my life, what I realized is, I recovered from this. And when I became a therapist, I thought, I first became a therapist not to treat eating disorders. I was a school teacher, then I became a school counselor, and someone said, oh, there's this girl that had that thing you had, And at first I was very reluctant, but when I met with this girl and I realized I felt like I could be inside her head, you know? And I also thought to myself, look, if I could do this, you can do it. I don't have any magical skills. And I just started down this path, and then it led to what I just said, and to opening this residential treatment center where I was able to, you know, hire a cook to come in and make beautiful foods. And we grew a garden, and we had meditation and yoga, and people thought, I mean, goes from running a charter hospital eating disorder unit to this beautiful place that was really a healing center. And I really, looking back now, can say I think it changed the course of events for what was offered as services for treatment and eating disorders.
Well, it's funny because I remember when we first met and we were talking about this in your backyard. You said something to me that was so obvious but really powerful. When I heard it, you said that it used to be that eating disorders were treated the same way that alcohol and drug addiction was treated.
Right.
But the problem was, you said, you know, an alcoholic or a drug addict can let go of those things, but they can't stop eating. You know,
Right.
eating is going to happen and it's going to be part of your life. And I'd never really put that together, but I thought, yeah, of course. I mean, you know, food is a very primal, everyday relationship. So when your fixation or your disorder is on that, you really have to look at it in a very different way.
You know, it seems so obvious, and it's still an ongoing, maybe a little bit ongoing controversy in the field, because there are still people who believe in doing it in the sort of addiction model, using the 12-step. I mean, certainly there are addictive components to it, but I remember thinking early on in my practice, when people were coming to me and telling me, you know, they were going to these OA meetings, and I was, you know, curious and inquisitive about it, wanted to know. And they described how one of the first steps was admitting they were powerless over food.
Mm.
And then I thought, oh, you know, look, you are a powerful human being, and here's food and here's you. You can't possibly be powerless. It's what you have come to think about food and what it comes to represent in your life, and whatever way you're using food or your weight, or even exercise as a way to deal with, distract from, or cope with other problems in your life. So it's not the food that's the problem, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And so a couple of interesting things that I remember when we spoke. One of the things that I learned as I got older, and I'm guessing for anyone who's watching or listening to this show who either has an interest in eating disorders or thinks they may be in one or have recovered from one of the things that maybe it would be great is if you could just give us a kind of overview of the differences between, say, why someone goes for anorexia over bulimia. And I'm asking that as someone who had bulimia in my teens. And it's something I read about, but I'm curious what you could give us as a kind of general or a kind of overview.
Yeah, well, I can certainly give you as a general, keeping in mind that, you know, people don't do what we want them to do and stay in their diagnostic categories. So we have a number of people who develop anorexia nervosa, for example, that then in recovery switch over to bulimia nervosa. So there's a shift, or even binge eating disorder. But we do know a lot more now about the temperament of people. And so there have been these temperament studies that look at genetics and all that, and look at predispositions, or let's say vulnerabilities to going towards one illness versus the other. And one of the things, particularly in restrictor anorexia nervosa, because there's also people who have anorexia who engage in binging and purging as well, but still meet the criteria for anorexia. But anyway, there's a temperament involved in anorexia that is has to do with perfectionism, more on the line of anxiety, compulsivity, you know, wanting order, you know, control junkies in a way. And interestingly enough, this leads to a whole, well, I'll put that aside for a second. So then you look at bulimia nervosa, and they tend to be people who are more risk takers, more on the impulse end of things, more jumping into things and then looking back later. Whereas someone who has the temperament of someone with this anorexia nervosa temperament is a little more, I'm going to look at everything and study it and know exactly what I'm doing before I jump in. And so you can see how that approach, it's why I have a assignment called How's My Relationship with Food Like My Relationship with People? Because you look at people who have anorexia and they will say, I'm very discerning about who I allow in my life. And I usually only have one friend and I'm not that gregarious at parties and on and on. And they are the same way with food. I take it in small bits. I like to know I eat the same things all the time. Whereas someone with bulimia might say, I try all variety of foods. One story I love telling is in this assignment, asking this girl who had bulimia nervosa, how's your relationship with food like your relationship with people? And she said, oh, I binge and purge men all the time. And the thing is, that's what she did, taking in relationships and then getting rid of them. That kind of impulse plays itself out in other areas of our lives. But the beauty of this, I think, is when I was listening to the researchers who were up there, giving the talks and saying, this is the temperament for anorexia nervosa. And they would say, perfectionism, anxiety, compulsivity. And I'm looking at that and I think to myself, well, I don't think I'm a perfectionist. I just think I'm detail oriented, and I don't feel like I have anxiety. I prefer to call that high energy or compulsive. I just have tenacity. And so when I watched this, and I've written about this, how we all have these temperaments, but they can be seen as liabilities or assets.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I do with people is I work with them at how do we take your traits from the darkness to the light? Because we're not going to get rid of them. I knew I was born with this kind of temperament. I was more anxious than my peers. I had school anxiety when I was a kid. I'm the person, reading the book on the school bus, with a flashlight, wanting to make straight A's. But how do you take that and help somebody learn how to channel that? And that, I think, is what's so beautiful about being recovered. Doesn't mean that you get rid of yourself. It means that you take yourself and you use your own traits for their highest good, which is really helped me, I think, in terms of my success in working with this population.
I love that. And it's funny because my personal development and metaphysical discovery journey went parallel with my healing from my teens. And there's so much crossover, like you said.
Yeah, mine too.
The things that you see that you're learning and uncovering about yourself. But it's funny, something just came to me. We love the show The Crown on Netflix, and we just watched season 3, and it details Diana, Princess Diana, enters the show.
I'm right there. I'm right at the part where they're showing her and the whole development of her bulimia. Yeah.
But here's what struck me. Those episodes where she's in her bulimia and we see evidence of her binge eating desserts and then throwing up in the toilet, they all were accompanied by a warning at the beginning of the show that you are about to see graphic scenes of. So the first thing I thought was, oh my God, how bad is this going to be? And then my second realization was, I'm like, and here we are in a world where we can watch people have their heads blown off, awful things happen, like really graphic, violent, terrible stuff. And there's never a warning for that.
Where's the trigger warning for that? Well, that's because activists and advocates in the field have been very upset at the various portrayals of eating disorders. And one of the things I think we're trying to do is help not trigger people. But I agree with you. People get exposed all the time. And I don't think watching something, that one thing, is going to cause an eating disorder. Because, like I said, it takes temperamental traits. It's also living in this culture, by the way. So it's not just having these traits. And then it's some other psychological and environmental, social stressors that come in. So it's a variety of things that are going to lead to an eating disorder. But that's an interesting point that you mentioned that.
Well, and the reason that it struck me was it showed me how behind we are. And I was kind of glad that it was being depicted, but I thought, wow, this could have been 25, 30 years ago that we were witnessing this thing that's been pushed aside. We don't talk about bulimia. We don't talk about, and I thought, well, that is a good thing, but it's very interesting that they felt the need to give a trigger warning, because I watched it and I'm like, oh yeah. I'm like, I know that scene. I lived that scene. I get it completely. But like you, I also managed to, that those impulses aren't active in me anymore. So it's just an interesting thing.
And it's so great to hear you say that, because, people, one of the things that I became known for is that I said you can be recovered. That's part of the whole, it's not an addiction. I'm not recovering for the rest of my life. I'm not fighting it one step at a time, you can really be recovered. And I think what needs to happen on shows, and I don't know what happens on this show, is that they often do things like show the really bad parts of the illness and the ugly parts, and don't give enough airtime and credence and understanding of how people get better, and that they do get better. And so in a way, I still have clients who come for seeking consultations who have been told they will have to learn how to manage this for the rest of their lives. And that's sad. And the other thing that's really important is when someone comes to me, I always say, I'm not going to go in there and take this eating disorder away, which is how a lot of people approach it. What I'm going to do is strengthen your healthy core soul self in there. And that part's going to heal the eating disorder. Not me, not a treatment program. That's the thing to do, no matter how small the healthy self, soul self is. And I use those in different ways, but we can, even if it's the tiniest little flame, blow on that, strengthen it, enhance it, hold up a mirror and show you where you have it. And that's what I think, really, right? I mean, ultimately, we heal ourselves. No amount of supervision or controlling a person in a treatment setting. You can put weight on somebody, but what happens when they leave,
Well, it's interesting because you even alluded to this in a way when you talked about the diagnoses of the anorexic as a perfectionist, they're controlling, and that's a very judgmental from the outside. I'll put this label on them and we'll slant it only in the negative, whereas you're able to go, yeah, I'm detail oriented, and that's actually a gift. And if that gift is allowed to be celebrated and to find a different place to put its energy, and the part of your energy that's going in another direction with it gets to heal. So I think there's something about that empathy too.
I think of it in terms of a frequency. How do you take that frequency, the same one that would go towards perfectionism? How do you turn it towards something that is of a higher goal or a higher nature or works for your higher self? But it's the same kind of energy, right? It's the same kind. Like my friend, who is also very impulsive, but she is the most spontaneous. She's the type of person where we're riding bikes. We're in somewhere around Vancouver. We're riding bikes, and she sees a lake, and she jumps off the bike and says, I'm going to go jump in it. And my tendency is, where's the signs? Is this on the map? Are we going to get in trouble? I have to think those things. But so we need all those kinds of temperaments. It's just that hers got her also into trouble with an addiction, and things that caused her to be impulsive in a different way. So I look at those, and I think being recovered is when you you accept your natural body size and shape, and you no longer use food or weight or exercise in self-destructive ways. And one of the parts in my definition of being recovered is that you are no longer willing to compromise your health or betray your soul, to look a certain way, wear a certain size, reach a certain number on the scale, and you no longer use food or your weight as a way to cope with, distract from, or deal with problems. So I put that up. I wrote that all down once in a book I wrote in 2006. It was such a fun book to write. It was questions and answers about eating disorders. And it so went into my temperament because I got to write all the questions and all the answers. It was so great. And I thought one of the questions had to be, because I talked about being recovered. Well, what is recovered? And I realized the definition in the field, I mean, it can't just be getting rid of the clinical diagnostic symptoms, because for bulimia, for example, that would mean you could still throw up once a week, but you didn't meet the criteria because the criteria was twice a week.
Mm.
So there are things that I realized that I wanted to write my own definition of what recovered is and say to clients who came to me, here's where we're going, where food and weight and shape take a proper perspective in your life. It's not like you have to never think about it. Obviously, I told you I got ready I put makeup on today. You can have concerns about the way you look, but they take a proper perspective and your brain doesn't get hijacked by them, which is what happens in an eating disorder.
Yeah, it's one of the gifts I had. I was about 22 and I had a really good friend in Manchester at the time. And she said to me one day, I was eating some chocolate with her. And so I was probably 3 years out of bulimia at that point. But, I was in Weight Watchers age 10. So for me, diet clinics were a reality from like the age of 9 through 16. So that's what I'd grown up with. And I was eating chocolate with her, and I can't remember what I said, but it was a light bulb moment when she turned around and she said, "Do you ever like just eat chocolate like it's a treat and I'm glad you did?" And I was like, it was like a revelation. I was like,
of course,
no, because surely now I should be worried that I'm going to gain the weight. And so, there's all of that mental conditioning.
And that's the cultural piece. That's the diet culture, pursuit of thinness. Image is more important than substance. And that's why my own healing came from my own discovery and journey I started vociferously reading, because back then, there were no treatment programs. And the couple first psychiatrists I went to had no idea. They had never even seen someone with anorexia before. And I was on a quest anyway, and I was beginning to read things like The Dancing Wooly Masters by Gary Zukav, stuff like that. I was reading about Buddhism, and I was starting to contemplate this whole idea of what it's like having a soul, what it's like being a soul, not even having a soul, being a soul, and the difference between ego and soul. And when you start looking at things like that, then everything becomes a little more like you re-enchant your life in a way. And in a way that when you're doing, diet culture and we're fed all this stuff about the way we're supposed to look and all that, there's no doubt in my mind that culture is a huge contributor to eating disorders. But you will see people talking about it, and this is where I also disagree, as an addiction, as or as a brain disease, because of the temperament and the genetic piece. Yes, we have done genetic studies, and yes, we know there's a vulnerability. But as I say to people, I'm recovered. My genes didn't change. My relationship to understanding myself and how I can use ancient practices like mindfulness, meditation things, and like yoga, that is all about helping me to, like yoga means, yoke or union, to help connect body, mind, and the divine. And that's why all those little pieces that I brought into when I opened a treatment center are things that had helped me. And I didn't know necessarily when I first started using them they were going to work, but I already had 15 years in private practice before I opened the residential. And I just realized there has to be a better way. And, I think maybe I should talk about the dream. Should I mention the dream?
Please do. I think this is a great time to talk about that.
Well, I want to say something about people who I was told in ways. Let me say this first. I was told in ways not to do this. I was told not to go out there and tell my clients, patients, I sort of interchange that word because people have different preferences, but that I was recovered because it was disclosing too much. And I knew that was like seeing somebody who got hit by lightning and I got hit by lightning and not telling them. It just felt not right. And so I think people who are watching this who, yes, I'm saying a lot of eating disorder stuff, but I'm also saying follow your instinct. When you have a yearning, when I knew it was right to tell people I'm recovered and you can too. I knew it was right to share that. I knew it was right that working in a hospital unit where I was seeing that people, we were not training them to go to the store and buy food and make it or grow it in a garden and have a more soulful relationship. It was about what weight are you putting on? And, when you have feelings like that, look around. There wasn't an alternative place for me to put them. So I ended up creating an alternative place. And believe me, there was no license for it. So I was first told that we don't have a license for that. We have a license for an old age home and we have a license for chemical dependency. There's no licensing program. But I just said, okay, well, I'm going to want to start one anyway. So if you want me to have a license, you better create something for me. There are ways, I think, if you just keep going. And also I didn't know if I opened it, if it was going to be filled. People said, oh, insurance isn't going to pay for it. And I know it was risky. And I know not everybody is going to take such a big risk, but I hope it can be a sign to even take a little risk in the direction of where your heart or your dreams are telling you to go. And I'll mention this dream that happened to me about at least 10 years before I opened Monte Nido. I had a dream where I had 6 girls. We were in a home. We had a chef cook a meal. We went for a hike. We came back to the home and we were sitting around talking, and then they were going off to their respective rooms for the evening. And I woke up and I told my husband, I had the weirdest dream. I had this dream about, it was kind of like a treatment center, but it was in a home. Anyway, fast forward 10 years later, a friend of mine was buying a house in the area called Monte Nido. And she wanted me to come look at it. She wanted to use it for a different purpose. And as I drove up the driveway, I had that weird, tingly deja vu feeling like I've been here before, but I'd never been off the canyon into the area of Monte Nido. And I got out of the car and I'm walking up the steps. It's that pringly kind of weird. I recognize this. By the time I walked in up to the kitchen, I absolutely knew, oh my God, this was my dream. And I know where the living room is. I know where the bedrooms are. I started getting all excited and I told my friend, you are not going to believe this, but I had a dream that I had 6 girls and had a treatment center here. Well, she ended up saying, I mean, bless her lovely heart. I mean, she ended up saying, you can have it. I think you're supposed to do this here. And I really felt pulled. I mean, my husband, the entrepreneur, said, well, if we're going to open a treatment center, let's look around at comparables in the neighborhood. It didn't I looked at a couple and I said, no, you don't understand. I'm supposed to do it here. And it was fascinating. I told you a little bit about the logistical things, but then we opened and we opened on a Friday. I only wanted, and also it was a 6-bed. And that's the license we could get there, was for 6. And that was my dream. So anyway, we opened, I took 3 people on a Friday. By Monday, I already had a full waiting list. And I was full without an empty bed and a waiting list until 9/11, when the planes, when that whole disaster happened and people couldn't get flights. And so it was a supposed to happen thing.
Yeah.
So as one of those dreams, I don't know how often people get those dreams, but I think sometimes we get those dreams and then don't pay enough attention, and the realization of that and being willing to have that be another factor in saying, I have to do this,
What was your husband's journey like, watching you do this, supporting you through it? Like, what was his experience of Monte Nido and everything that you've done?
You know, he was a big advocate for me in many ways. He saw what was happening to me in the hospital system, the things I could and couldn't do with people. I got $5,000 a month from the hospital, and yet I had to hire my own assistants underneath that because
Mm.
I said we need a special dietitian and we need recovery coaches, but they weren't going to pay for that, so I paid for it out of my own salary. And he saw just what was happening. And he has been someone who literally, I think, has seen the vision as much as I and thought, you're supposed to do this for people. Lucky for him, you know, I'm not really a big business person. And so he actually helped with getting all the legalese, you know. And I was really scared when I saw, oh, it's going to cost this much money. But he's kind of a risk taker. I said, my temperament's not.
Yeah.
And it was really grateful to have somebody who has his kind of temperament. You know, we became a good match in that way.
That's great. And I love that one of the things that you've been doing also is training recovery coaches, basically. So not just the work that you did, but that's something that you've really invested time and years in.
Well, you know, what happened is Monte was a gap in the field. We had outpatient treatment and then we had hospitals. And after I sold Monte, it was kind of depressing in some ways. I was going to stay on. That didn't really work out. And I felt a little bit like, you know, I had this baby and now it was kind of gone. And then I
Why did you
realized,
sell it, Carolyn? Let me just ask you that before we go any further.
say
What
that
made,
again.
yeah, what made you sell it?
Well, what I really thought is I was going to take on partners, and I was going to take on these partners that were had money. I had moved across to the East Coast because 30% of our patients were coming from there, and people were begging me open up on the East Coast, and I was reluctant to do that. And so I thought, I don't want to do it by myself. And I met these great partners and just sold a percentage of the business, not really understanding, and they had a higher percentage of the business, not really and then that was great, the first deal. But then they wanted to sell, and I can't even criticize them because they were equity people. That's the business they're, you know, it's like that Zen koan about the scorpion that stings the person that takes him across the river, you know? I mean, you can't, that's his nature. It was their nature. All of a sudden, then now I'm expanded. I'm now on the East Coast. We bought a place in Florida. It became a little bit overwhelming, but they wanted to sell again. And so I kind of had to go along with that. But I still thought I'll stay as clinical director, and I can do that. But through a series of events, Bruce, my husband, who was the CEO of the company, had 2 heart attacks, and I had to make a decision. I was already just sort of separating with clinical ideas with the new owners. And now my husband is in this situation, and I realized I had to make a decision. I'm walking on the beach, and it just came to me. I have to let it go. You know, nothing lasts forever. I've trained a number of people. I've set this up. Hopefully, let it continue, and maybe there's something else for me. You know, and then the coaching thing. Then what did happen is a few little seeds got planted in this coaching thing. And I realized I always trained therapists differently than other therapists because I always trained therapists, many of them who were recovered. So people sought me out at Monte who were recovered. Whereas a lot of treatment programs, even to this day, even if you are recovered from an eating disorder, you're not allowed to tell the clients or the patients, which I just think is so sad. But anyway, I think it's so backwards. I mean, several of them have changed their tune and now allow it, but a lot of them still don't. But so I was training recovered staff anyway, and I also trained them to do things. Now imagine this: if you're a therapist and you go to school and you're trained as a therapist, no one teaches you how to sit down at a restaurant and eat a meal with someone with anorexia, or someone with bulimia, or someone with binge eating disorder who wants to order all this food and is all of a sudden having all these cravings, or someone with bulimia who gets up from the table and goes running to the bathroom? How do you train? So I always trained staff. My therapists couldn't just show up to a treatment center and do their individual therapy session and go home. Every therapist who worked for me had to agree that they would also sit down and have 1 or 2 meals during the week with the clients, so they could actually be there at the moment when the clients needed the most help.
Yeah.
And that was really interesting because a lot of therapists are like, what? You want me to eat? And I said, yeah, that's part of the job. You know, I understand it if you don't feel comfortable, but then training them also, take the person who has had to gain 10 pounds or 20 pounds or 30 pounds with anorexia nervosa. They need to buy new clothes. How is that going to feel for them?
Mm.
I needed therapists to be able to go. I needed to train these people to be able to go take them to the store. We did all kinds of things. We put positive sticky notes on the mirrors in the dressing rooms before they went in. And, you know, we would help them take clothes off the rack and not look at the numbers. So they had a number to define themselves with, and all these different things that we did. Or how do you sit with someone when you're putting your arm around them and helping them get through when they really feel like purging after they just ate something like maybe a piece of cake that I haven't eaten for 5 years. So fast forward to realization that there's still a gap that exists, and there's sober coaches and life coaches and you know, all kinds of addiction coaches out in the field. And I realized, why are there not eating disorder coaches? And I'd thought about this before because I had trained people. At the time I called them support counselors, not coaches. But I thought, why is that? And part of it is the field was kind of let's just say a little dismissive of it, and partly because they would say things like, this is a very difficult mental illness. You know, someone can't just be a recovery coach and expect to know what to do. You know, who does the training? There was a lot of reaction to it, whereas the 12-step community had been functioning for years in a whole different arena.
Yeah.
They had been going before treatment centers for chemical dependency were even set up. So it was a little different. They were already, the 12-step thing and sponsors were already way in power. You know what I'm saying? We're already all over.
Totally.
So I thought, you know, I think part of it is that there's no certification process. It's true that you don't want to think you can treat somebody just because you had an eating disorder. That doesn't make you capable of treating somebody. But if you did have an eating disorder and you are interested in giving back, there are a lot of skills you can learn. And I realized a lot of those skills were skills I had taught my therapist: how to sit with someone during a meal, you know, how to take someone shopping, how to go to their house. Like in chemical dependency, when someone leaves a treatment center, sponsors often go to their home, get rid of all the alcohol that's still in there or the drugs, you know, help them transition. There was nothing like that for eating disorders. So
it's so weird hearing you say this though, because as I'm listening to you, especially when you talked about going shopping, like I can think of countless times in my 20s and my 30s, less so I would say the last 5 to 10 years, because I'm kind of used to myself and kind of know what some of my triggers might be.
Yeah.
And I know how to move myself through them. I can't, just so many times I would get distressed in a dressing room, in a store, trying on clothing. And I remember like telling like, you know, a boyfriend or a friend I had at the time, and they didn't understand, like but it's so true. It's all of those other triggers that you have that, you know, that the eating disorder is one thing, but the way it shows up in your life,
it can linger, you know, and it can keep you, it can either keep you ill. I call all those little things recovery sabotaging things, you know, like they may be what a lot of other people do, but for someone who had an eating disorder, they can be triggers. And how you can work them out into not being triggers is exposure and having somebody who's gone through it. Now, not all of my coaches have a history of an eating disorder. There are some people who've applied for the coaching program who maybe had a child or maybe had a friend, or is a nurse or a therapist who wants more skills. But I would say 95% of the people who've become certified are recovered. And it to me, I just can't imagine when I hear people say who have an eating disorder say, I've never met anyone who was recovered. I always say, and to this day, that seems so odd to me, but it still happens, especially from other countries. But I always say, how sad to have an illness and you've never had a conversation with somebody who's had it and gotten over it. And they're out there, but I realize they just needed training. So the training's pretty significant. It takes about a year. Some people finish a little sooner. Some people take a little longer. And there's a lot of exams, and there's an internship that I supervise every single case and listen to every single session, because I want to make sure that if they, it has my name on it, and I want to make sure they're out there, doing the right thing. But at this point, I think we have I'm probably off a little bit, but about 57 coaches. Some of them aren't graduated yet, but in about now at this point, it's 10 or 11 countries.
Wow. So here's the interesting thing about this conversation, because on the one hand, my mind goes, a bunch of people watching or listening may have dropped off because they're like, oh, I don't know anything about eating disorders. This doesn't interest me. So I'm going. But on the other hand, the truth for me about everything in life is everything is on a scale. Like, we're all somewhere on an energy scale of all of the isms and schisms that are there. Now, a full-blown drug addict has gone all the way up the drug addiction scale. But the tendencies, the some of the behaviors, some of the reasons to get lost in drugs exist in all of us at some level. It's just we haven't necessarily gone down that route. So the one thing that keeps coming up as we talk, we're such a body judgmental, body shaming, body dysmorphic culture. And it's so in our culture that even anyone listening or viewing who may never have felt like they had an eating disorder, I bet so many people relate to this idea of not liking their body, wishing they were a bit thinner, not liking trying on outfits, because it's so woven into our culture. And it's so interesting that this is kind of where we're at. But I do feel like there is a lot of healing happening. And even that Netflix disclaimer tells us that something that has clearly been taboo in our society that we're not supposed to talk about is now being brought to a bit more prominence, even if they still feel it has to have a trigger warning at this point.
Right. Well, it's many people have said, what you're teaching, for example, as far as the whole ego and soul piece, helping people realize you have an ego and you also have a soul, or are a soul. And helping people distinguish that, and ego is important for identity and all those things that help us, define who we are as separate from somebody else, that make, I am a teacher, or I am a therapist, or I am a wife, but also I weigh this much, or I run this many miles, or all the things that we think make us who we are. And then there's this essence core self in there, that when you spend some time really understanding that and engaging in that, you start to have a different perspective on your life. And that's not just for eating disorders. That kind of lesson is a big lesson for everyone who's trying to navigate this culture. So just that's one tiny thing, and the things that I tried to teach. And I see myself as a teacher as much as a therapist, because I think that the people who come to me, there are things that even if they were connected to in the beginning, got disconnected. And when you get reconnected to that part of yourself, and you even learn how to take a few steps back and be in that wise presence where you watch your thoughts go by, where you learn to respond versus react, all those things that we know from, and which are old Buddhist principles, acceptance versus resistance. These are lessons that are useful, and they are useful for me today. And my eating disorder is gone years ago, but they still help me today. So I agree with you. I think these are universal kinds of things.
Totally. And if I'm not mistaken, I I was reading earlier, you have care for the soul, was one of the let me see, yeah, known for bringing care of the soul to your treatment philosophy and work settings. And
Yeah.
it's interesting because that was so evident when we met, but even in the story that you shared about David and Maten, you said what, 30 years ago, 25 years ago, you had them with small groups in the facility,
Yeah.
before they had gone on to kind of, spread across the world the way they have.
Yeah, it's because I had a group. Well, it's for a number of reasons I did that, but part of it was I had a group, and in this group, I brought in, angel cards and had
Mhm.
them draw angel cards, and I never had anyone believe in a certain spiritual, you don't have to follow a religious thing, but you can do whatever it is with these cards. But let me just show you what it might be like to put your energy towards this deck and see what card you pull. And they were always beautiful cards, but I also taught them to chant, and I taught them to do Om. And I said, just see how this feels to you resonating. And I had Deva's rendition of Om, and I taught them other songs, and we would go out and look at the moon and talk about that, the whole concept of the cosmos and all these things. I mean, I didn't have kids, so in a way I think they were my kids,
Yeah.
uh but all those things, and bringing all those things, it in one way it also gives people not just all the work to what are you recovering from, but what you are recovering to is a big part of this, because people need to see that when they're letting go of something. I know I was terrified to let go of it, all the fear that comes with it, and it didn't feel like an illness, it kind of felt like who I was. So I had to go through this transformation to realize I'm not getting rid of this part of myself. I'm integrating it back in so that I'm a whole self again, but I don't need the behaviors. Does that make sense?
Completely, completely. And it's funny, over the years with all the one-on-one sessions I did, sometimes addiction would come into it as an aspect with the work I would do with people. And the one thing I had learned that I would relay out is, if you're trying to eliminate something from your life, you have to bring something new in at the same time or before. Like,
Exactly.
you can't, otherwise it's just loss. All you're focused on is loss. But if you're
Exactly.
if you're giving yourself something else, something new, something's coming in that wasn't there before, it's going to give you a much better chance of balancing across into that new thing and letting go of the destructive.
You know that experiment in chemistry where there's this, I don't know if you ever took chemistry, but where there's this tube, this U tube, and it has blue water in. And it's like, okay, you have this red water. You can't turn the tube upside down. How do you get the blue water out? Well, you pour the red water in, and it comes in like
Mm.
this, and then the, kind of slowly pushes the blue water out. And I used to talk about that a lot when I talked about body image, because other treatment centers would do things like, have, this just kills me, lie down on the body, I mean, on the floor on a piece of paper and do a body tracing, and then write the parts that they were upset with and things like that. Or, I mean,
Yeah.
or let's see you put something around, and what is the real size of your arm, and what do you think the size of your arm is, and see people have a big thing. And although it seems to make sense because you're trying to see how distorted they are, one, I think that makes people be distorted on purpose because they certainly don't want to get it wrong and get, you know what I mean?
Mm.
But the other thing
Completely.
is, it puts all this focus on body, 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 body image. And to me, I always say it's like telling people don't think about a white horse. So I never had a body image group at Monte Nido.
Yeah.
I had a body and soul group. And so I would do things and say, I'd come in and say things like, okay, I want you today to write a letter to your body from your soul, right? Or I would come in and say, let's say Karen died today, and Karen, lie down on the floor. Okay. Now I want everybody to write on a piece of paper what's here and what's gone, which is a fascinating thing to have people do, because, what's here and they can get very creative, this lifeless carcass of flesh, hair, skin, bones, whatever, and what's gone. And they would, these beautiful essence, soul, spirit, they had a lot of words for it. But ultimately, then, what have you been paying more attention to? Where has been your God? What have you been putting your allegiance to? How much time have you been spending obsessing over the stuff on the left side of the paper versus nurturing the stuff on the right side of the paper, and helping people realize in a whole different way, healing. I would say to them, you thought you came for eating disorder treatment, but in a way it's life school.
Mm.
Because I think when you are healed in that way, and we treat our body like our beautiful earth suits, here on the planet, housing our soul, I think that those other symptoms, I mean, they become less and less necessary. In fact, people start to see them fading as not making sense anymore.
I love everything you just said, and I just want to encourage listeners or viewers that if you resonate with that, I love that. Write a love letter to your body from your soul. So I just want to
Yeah.
hold that up. Write a
Yeah.
love letter to your body from your soul. If you're listening and you're like kind of churning some of the body dysmorphia stuff, or the, yeah, I don't like this. Yeah, that's a great thing to do. Write a love letter to your body from your soul.
Do you want me to give you another one?
Oh
Or
yes, go on, go on.
Okay, another assignment that I would do in that particular group was, I would say, okay, were sent from Mars. I just made that up as a planet, and you come to this planet, and I want you to describe a flower, and you have to describe it, using, and it would be so interesting. You have to describe it. You can't say, it's the color peach. You have to say it's the same color as the earth when they have their sunsets, or kind of figuring
Mhm.
out a way, and talk about the thorns on the flower or for protection and stuff like that. And they were amazingly good at doing these kinds of assignments. But then, and this is what happens and this is a beginner's mind kind of experiment, then I would say, okay, now I'm your commander from Mars, and I'm saying, describe the human body, describe the body that you have been given, that you have inhabited to live on Earth. And I will accept nothing less than the way you described the flowers, because there was no pejorative stuff about the flowers. Nobody wrote, her
Mm.
petals are smaller than mine. And I'd go around looking at what they were writing. And if they started to do that, I would say, nope, nope, yep,
No
start
one
over.
said this flower could lose a bit of weight. I love it. That's
Right,
brilliant.
right. Your thorns are too big. Anyway, so it was beautiful, because I would just think of these things up sometime driving to work. And I would look at what they wrote. They would look at what they wrote,
Mm.
and the kinds of things about the human body, and they would write about it, and the things that it did, and the functions that it served, and everything that it allowed them to do as a human on the planet. Had I just said, write all the good things about having a body, that wouldn't have worked. And so this is the way I think you make it more soulful, when you bring in a kind of, well, beginner's mind, I think. And Thomas, I read all the Thomas More books, Care of the Soul and The Reenchantment of Everyday Life, and and even Dark Nights of a Soul, where he talks about, nobody wishes a major illness on anybody, but once you have one, you sift it for its gold. And there's no doubt in my mind that anorexia nervosa was one of my biggest teachers. And that's the other thing that I tell people. I don't want them to feel ashamed that they have this. I talk about the opportunity it gives them to learn things that they may never have gone down that path.
I so agree with that. I so agree with that. So I'm curious, Carolyn Costin, you've had this incredible, you've been a really important pioneer in your field, and you've had like a 40-year journey with holding space as a pioneer in this field. If you could time machine yourself today back to 1980. And not because anything has gone wrong, and I'm sure you're like me, I just believe everything that we learn, we're meant to go through. But if you had the opportunity to time machine back 40 years and just give Carolyn Costin in 1980 like 2 or 3 tips that might save her some time, might help her not go through certain struggles as she's done this pioneering work, what are the 2 or 3 things that come to mind?
Boy, it's such a good question. And the only one really stands out. And it is, my husband told me a long, long time ago, and I'm not sure I'm right about this, but I'm going to tell you what pops up. He encouraged me to open more residential treatment centers, Monte Nido centers. He encouraged me to have, you know, you could have these in all the different states. And I was really reluctant. I liked my little one, you know, then I opened another one, and then, you know, and it did get rather large even when I still had it. But I was afraid to have it go too big. And I was kind of afraid that it would lose some nature of soul, you know? But
Yeah.
I think, what's that?
No, I mean, I
You
understand that.
understand?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think in retrospect, I had trained enough people, because I was so fortunate to have people who were with me like 10, 15, 18, 20, 22 years, that I had a good cadre of people, and I probably could have had those places and maybe given more people the kind of treatment that I think is really healing and really worked. I mean, we didn't even talk about the outcome studies. This was not just something that, oh, Carolyn's doing this wacky thing in California and now in New York, but, you know, or wherever, you know, it grew. It we have a 1 to 10 year outcome study that was amazing. And I was like this when it was coming out, because you don't really know until you do the data. And we followed all the patients 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, a year and a half, 2 years, and every year for 10 years. And it was outrageous, the rates of recovery in both bulimia and anorexia. So I know it worked. And so sometimes I think, had I do over again, maybe I wouldn't be so afraid to expand with the team that I had. On the other hand, as you know, could be that if I expanded, maybe I would have lost control of it earlier, and, you know, who knows? So it's so hard to say.
Yeah. What do you, I mean, I know the world is a different place today than when you were beginning, you know, everything you were doing, but I don't know. I mean, I'm projecting or assuming, but I'm just imagining the amount of resistance that you had to have the strength to kind of ignore, push against, you know, carry on with what you were doing.
That's a really good question, especially for listeners who want to do things, because one of the things that I was told early on by some top people in the field, you know, Carolyn, do you want to be known as someone who's recovered? Or do you want to be known as a good eating disorder therapist? And I walked away feeling a little shamed and kind of with my tail between my legs. These were a couple of top people in the field at the time. And it didn't take me long to go, that is ridiculous. Why can't I be both? Yeah. And even though it was a little bit scary, like people say, you were so brave to come out and speak with hundreds of people at a conference. I was the first person to stand up at an international eating disorder conference and say, I'm recovered. And this conference was started by 12-step people. I didn't know that when I first applied to speak, but people came up to me and I was like, I was scared, but I did it anyway. And people always talk about, you were so brave being a pioneer and saying you were recovered. And honestly, I was led by truth, you know, and that's why I love that name Satya that I was given, you know, because it means truth. And I think sometimes when you're led by truth, you're led by conviction. And I just felt like it's important to do. It's important to get up and say this. And I also brought other people who I had treated, and they talked about being recovered after having treatment, and not just for 6 months or a month. At the first international conference where I spoke, I brought about 4 or 5 people who were recovered from all the different eating disorders, and talk about how they had been recovered for 2 years or 5 years or 6 years. So I didn't just use myself, because I mean, myself would have been good, but I think it was better to
Yeah.
show that this is just not me. This can be other people too. But I want to briefly say that also, being a female in this field, all the people who ran all the stuff in the beginning, the hospitals and the academic journals that came out, and that were also men. And I have to say that it was sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle, but there was definitely a different kind of treatment towards me. Especially now, I'm a recovered person and I'm female, I'm opening a residential center. There was um, a lot of talk, let's say, and a lot of people trying to get me not to do it, for one thing. And then the way it was referred to, and still today in this field, I feel a little bit like, I started the first residential, I opened the first day treatment program in the US that was unattached to a hospital. I have 6 books, and I see people, well, it's probably my ego being involved in this, but I'm just saying, I think as a female, I also had an uphill battle. Let's
I
just
don't know
say.
why I asked you, because when I think back to then, like even just the other day, like I'll watch any show that has female characters. Like that's always been more interesting to me. It's not that I don't love certain men, but what I always notice is how heavily criticized those shows are, and the level of sexism in the reviewers that's probably unconscious. And we were watching one right now, and I just said to Stephen, wow, it's amazing. You read the reviews of this show. If it was 2 male actors in the lead, this would be like off the charts success. But it comes down a little bit, and they make subtle digs about the women. And I'm like, God, when is this going to go away? It's
Well,
going to
yeah, I mean,
take time. But I think of you 40 years ago doing what you were doing. Yeah.
I would give lectures, and in the evaluation sometimes have people critiquing my clothing or the length of my skirts,
Mm-hmm.
like, what about what I said?
Mm-hmm.
you know
Yeah. Yeah. No, I wondered about that. And so I'm curious, and this probably is just a good way for us to bring our conversation to a close. What's next for you? Like in this next few years, like what do you have any new visions, or anything that you're working on right now that you feel passionate about?
Well, funny you should ask, because for a while I said I'm not writing any more books. I've been really pushed by the Norton and Sons, who I wrote the 8 Keys book and workbook for, and they really want me to come up with another book because it's done well for them. And I said, I have enough books out there, but I can feel this brewing, this thing about, it's a little bit about the soul piece. It's a little bit about, it's going to sound weird, but it's about the relationship between developing an eating disorder, or we could even say disordered eating, or this unnatural relationship with our food and our body, and what it has to do with spirituality and quantum physics.
Now
And
that sounds fantastic.
it will be a hard book to write, but the reason I think it's so important is because what we know now, and I'm a neophyte, but I read a lot. What we know now about the field, the quantum field, and about the potentiality that exists, and how we as human beings, how we focus our attention and what we focus our attention on, how we don't create reality, but we kind of extract reality from all the potentials that are out there, like we learn about what happens in atoms, as protons pop in and out, being wave-like, or not material matter, until there's a focus, and then they pop into focus. And I think there's a lot of, when you look at ancient spiritual teaching, they talk about that. They talk about how we're all connected, not do unto others as you would have others do unto you, but do unto others because they are you,
Totally.
And I know it will be a hard book to write, but I've had flashes of it, but I haven't felt ready. And all of a sudden the other day I felt, and maybe it's this long rest from COVID, because it's been a big rest for me in many ways.
Mm.
All my conferences were, speaking engagements, everything, canceled. Um, I think maybe I needed that rest, to feel like I had the energy to birth another book, because it is like it is like
Oh yeah.
it's a big
Oh yeah,
project.
no, books are a big, big thing. Yeah, no, and I'm glad you brought that up because I actually, before we go, I wanted you to, which book would you recommend, or books of yours, if anyone wanted to read one of your books, which one would you highlight, which one or two?
Well, the one that I think is the most cultural one, and you don't even have to have an eating disorder, and it's an interesting one. It's called Your Dieting Daughter. But what I do in that book, you don't have to have a daughter who's dieting to what I do in that book is talk a lot about culture and what has happened in the culture and
Mm,
how young girls and young boys are treated differently. And just there's a lot of data in that book about how to be in the world, even if you have a niece or you're a teacher, and you're around young girls. I mean, unfortunately, it's just specifically related, to females, and I really should do an alternative one for males someday. That who knows.
yeah.
That's probably the one that has the most information about culture and technology, especially the new version of that book where I talk about social media and things like that. But I think if you're struggling, and even if it's just with disordered thoughts and
Mm,
feelings and body image and all that, then I think, Eight Keys to Recovery from an Eating Disorder, because that's where I really talk about ego and soul. That's where I really do mindfulness practice, help people learn how to feel their feelings, challenge their thoughts, but feel their feelings, reach out to others. There's a lot of things in that book that I think help you just get help with being a human in this world. And how do I get help when I feel like I'm stuck,
yeah.
So probably that. And I wrote that book with a former client, Gwen Grab, who recovered and became a therapist, and we wrote it together. And it's funny because I would write things, and then she would write, I know what you're thinking. I thought this was, ridiculous too, about the soul self. And then she would talk about how it helped heal her. So it's an
Fantastic.
interesting book about us going back and forth.
Fantastic. Well, great. Well, we'll put some links in the show notes to your website and these books. And for anyone who wants to dive in with you a little bit more, they can go to carolyn-costin.com. And
They
we'll
don't even
also,
have to. It can just be Carolyn CarolynCostin.com, and it'll automatically go
perfect.
to that one. Yeah,
Perfect.
that's
Okay,
easier.
that's great. But thank you for being here today. When I first met you, I think we walked away and I said to Stephen, I said, she's lovely, she's funny, and I love her fire. I see how those three qualities and many more in this conversation with you have really driven
Oh,
and fed your work. So I'm really grateful to you for impacting the world the way that you have, and impacting culture around this the way that you have. And thank you for being here today.
thank you so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure. I've been excited. It's one of the highlights I've been looking forward to during this whole lockdown time. So I really,
Yeah.
really appreciate it.
Well, and hopefully we'll be in person together soon. But yeah, thank you,
Okay.
Carolyn. Lots of love. And yeah, to anyone who wants to learn more about Carolyn's work, check out the show notes and we'll put all of the links there. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Welcome to Transmissions 2021. We are bringing Transmissions back this summer because last year, when we first presented it, it was not only our most popular offering ever, we had several thousand of you join us from around the world. It was a way that I and my team could bring some of the energy of Soul Magic, our annual retreat, to you in the comfort of your own home, more affordably, and with no limit on how many people we could serve. So Transmissions is a metaphysical, intuitive, and self-growth deep dive to allow you to cultivate more energy for your life and for you to bring to the world. The themes for this year are going to be joy, healing, expression, freedom, and magic. The way that these topics are explored is through 5 live broadcasts where I will not only teach intuitively, but I will channel my guides, the Z's. We provide transcripts, audio downloads of each session. There is an energy blueprint that you will receive ahead of the course starting, where I write a document basically that I channel about what energies we're going to be cultivating, looking at, moving, releasing. We also have several supplemental materials and videos from members of my team. So there are meditations, there are videos that help you support yourself as you go through a journey like this. We also have the private members forum, which is away from social media, so you can privately share and discuss with all other members of the course. The final element of our Transmissions courses is the music album that Davor Bozik and I create. This is both spoken word and music, and it's 5 10-minute tracks. You may have seen that we've just publicly released last year's album, which we created for course members. So you can stream that right now on Spotify or wherever you get your music. But for this year, we will exclusively be bringing you Transmissions Volume 2, which will be available this year only to course members. So we invite you to check out the course page, read more details, and if it resonates for you to join us for Transmissions 2021, we would love to welcome you aboard.